"Get your hands off my luggage." Isolde Crane Vane, 32-year-old wife of Decker Vane, spoke quietly as Berenice Vane, 62-year-old mother of Decker and the Vane family's self-appointed social director, pulled the first dress from the open travel bag and threw it toward her face. The fabric struck Isolde's cheek and dropped at her feet. She did not flinch. She stood on the private stone terrace of Thorngate Estate, a mountain retreat that Orrin Vane, 64-year-old patriarch and public chairman of Vane Meridian Hotels, still called his crown jewel, while her belongings were scattered across the cold slate floor below her. Decker Vane, 39-year-old husband of Isolde and executive vice president of guest experience at Vane Meridian Hotels, watched from the terrace doorway. Beside him stood Larissa Safen, 31-year-old vice president of brand development at Vane Meridian and Decker's mistress, her hand resting against his arm as though she had already replaced the woman standing 12 feet away. Berenice lifted another blouse and threw it harder. "You came into this family wearing borrowed clothes and borrowed confidence," she said. "You leave the same way." Isolde touched her burning cheek. She looked at her husband. "Are you going to let them do this?" Decker looked at his mother, then at Larissa, then at the terrace railing. He said nothing. Bertram Grimm, 56-year-old family attorney and personal counsel to Orrin Vane, stepped forward and placed a leather folder on the stone table. Inside was a divorce petition and a proposed settlement agreement. The settlement protected each spouse's inherited and separate property. Orrin had insisted on that clause before their wedding, believing he was shielding the Vane family from a woman with nothing. Decker picked up the pen. Isolde watched him sign both documents without stopping, without raising his eyes, without a single word to her. Larissa watched him finish and then slowly smiled. The Vanes believed the quiet woman in the plain dress owned nothing and had nowhere powerful to go. They did not know that Isolde Crane was the only daughter of Whitmore Crane, a reclusive hospitality billionaire who had spent 40 years building the Crane Heritage Group into one of the most influential private holding companies in North American hospitality. They did not know she was chief executive officer, or that the Crane Heritage Group held 71% of Vane Meridian Hotels' voting shares through a trust bearing her father's name. And they did not know that 22 months ago, Isolde had personally authorized the rescue that kept Vane Meridian from collapsing entirely. 18 months before Decker signed those papers, Orrin Vane had sat across from bankruptcy counsel at midnight. Vane Meridian owed $63 million in deferred maintenance contracts, unpaid vendor invoices, and payroll obligations it could not cover. The Vane name had not been enough to convince lenders to extend credit a third time. Orrin had called Decker. Decker had come home to their kitchen and cried with his head against Isolde's shoulder. She had held him until he fell asleep. Then she had called her attorney and begun the acquisition. By morning, the Crane Heritage Group had entered as a rescue partner. Orrin kept his chairman title during a protected transition period so employees and guests would not panic. Isolde had allowed it because she cared about the 3,000 workers whose livelihoods depended on the company surviving the chaos. She had never lied to Decker. Before their marriage, she had told him her father left her a private trust containing hospitality and real estate investments under professional management. Decker had nodded and assumed it was small because Isolde wore ordinary shoes and drove an unimpressive car and never once used money to make herself larger in any room. He had confused her restraint with emptiness. Now she stood on a terrace paid for with vendor contracts that her money had kept from being cancelled, watching her husband sign a divorce petition beside the woman who had spent 8 months learning how he took his coffee. Orrin threw one of Isolde's scarves over the railing. It caught the mountain wind and sailed off the edge. "Stand up straighter," Berenice said to Decker. "You have always been too sentimental." Isolde bent down and gathered the clothes closest to her without another word. Greer, 51-year-old head of housekeeping at Thorngate, who had worked the property for 19 years, appeared in the terrace doorway and stepped forward to help. Orrin pointed at her. "Take one more step toward her things, and you are finished at this property." Greer stopped. Her face remained still. Decker did not intervene on Greer's behalf either. Isolde collected what she could reach and left the rest. She walked out of Thorngate in a black car driven by her executive assistant Solange Ames, 37, who had worked for the Crane Heritage Group since Isolde's father was alive and who understood every secret Isolde had ever carried. Solange did not ask if she was all right. She simply held Isolde's hand across the back seat while the mountain road curved away from the estate. Isolde sat perfectly still until the pine trees closed behind them. Then her shoulders began to shake. 6 weeks before the terrace, the first crisis arrived without warning. Isolde was standing in the Crane Heritage Group's Regional Operations Center when Thaddeus Crane, 55-year-old lead independent director and the Crane Heritage Group's appointed board representative at Vane Meridian, placed a financial summary on the table in front of her. Vane Meridian's flagship Charleston property was 48 hours from losing its contracted linen service. 3 of its Atlanta properties had deferred maintenance invoices past 90 days. A catering supplier for the convention centers had sent a final payment demand that morning and would suspend service before the weekend conference season began. "How did this get this far?" Isolde asked. Damaris Hale, 44-year-old chief operating officer and one of the few executives who knew Isolde's true identity inside the company, slid a second document across the table. Colm redirected the operating reserve last month. Colm Crome, 42, was Vane Meridian's chief financial officer and a childhood friend of Decca's. He had controlled the company's daily accounts under authority delegated during the rescue transition, and had spent years treating the company's cash flow as a personal obligation to the Vane family first. "Where did he send it?" Isolde asked. Damaris hesitated. "Tell me." Part of it covered the Thorngate renovations. The rest funded a brand activation event that Larissa Fenn scheduled in New York. Isolde closed the file. Decca had told her the Thorngate renovations were coming out of family savings. Apparently he had not verified that, or had not wanted to. She looked through the glass at the operations floor below. Staff members were making calls. No one down there had any idea that their company's reserve account had been emptied to pay for heated marble floors and a 2-day influencer event in Manhattan. She could have withheld the rescue payment and let the vendors cancel. If the convention season collapsed before lenders or the board could be prepared, every meeting that followed would turn against Orin and Decca before either of them could shape an explanation. For one long moment she imagined it. Then she thought about the banquet servers who worked double shifts during conference season. She thought about the housekeeping staff in Atlanta who had just signed new lease agreements based on the assumption their jobs were secure. She thought about the families who had saved for months for a weekend at one of the flagship properties. They were not weapons. "Botanize the emergency transfer," Isolde said. "Send it directly to the vendors, not through Vane Meridian's general account. I'll sign the tablet this afternoon." "How much?" Thaddeus asked. "Whatever it takes to protect the season." She approved the transfer before Decca arrived at the offices that morning. He walked through the lobby in a pressed suit and exchanged easy handshakes with staff who did not know his wife had spent the last hour protecting their paychecks. He saw Isolde through the conference room glass and gave her a distracted nod. He assumed she was there on behalf of the Crane Heritage Foundation, the philanthropic arm most Vane Meridian employees associated with her presence. He turned away without stopping. Larissa Fenn walked beside him carrying 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Decca without breaking stride, and her fingers rested briefly against his hand as she passed it over. "No sugar," she said. "Just how you like it before a board walkthrough." Isolde turned back to the audit summary she had ordered and kept working. The evidence arrived in stages, the way it always does when someone has been careful for a long time. First, the travel manifests. Damaris brought them 2 weeks into the audit. Larissa's name appeared beside Decca's on 11 flights he had never mentioned to Isolde. 3 of those trips ended in cities where Vane Meridian had no active properties and no scheduled business. Then came the hotel record. One of those trips had produced a receipt from a boutique property in Charleston. Decca and Larissa had stayed in the same suite, under a single reservation billed to the company's brand development budget. Isolde held the receipt for a long time. She told herself there might be an explanation. She had told herself that before. The explanation never materialized. Then came the gala. Vane Meridian's annual investor reception was held at the flagship Charleston property, a restored 19th century building with ironwork balconies and a candlelit ballroom that travel magazines regularly named one of the finest event spaces on the East Coast. Isolde had quietly signed the infrastructure guarantees that kept that building operating 2 years ago. Before the event, a garment bag arrived at their hotel room. Inside was a shapeless pewter dress. A handwritten note from Berenice was attached. "Wear this. You'll blend in better with the other guests." Isolde had dresses at home that cost more than anything Berenice had ever worn to a public event. She put on the pewter dress. She had learned years ago that rejecting Berenice's choices produced arguments that somehow ended with Isolde apologizing for having feelings about them. At the reception, a photographer arranged a group portrait near the grand staircase. Radcott Welsh, 38-year-old public relations director, and Larissa's closest corporate ally, gestured toward a space near the buffet table. "Mrs. Vane, we'll need you to stand with the other guests. This section is reserved for core leadership." Isolde looked at the arrangement. Orin stood at the center. Berenice stood beside him in a necklace that cost more than most junior employees earned in a quarter, though she had never held a position at Vane Meridian. Decca stood to Orin's other side. Larissa stood one step behind Decca's shoulder with the practiced ease of someone who had rehearsed the position. Decca heard the instruction. He did not say anything. Isolde stepped out of the frame. The photographer adjusted, and the flash fired. Later, near the ballroom's east entrance, she noticed the bracelet. A slender gold cuff on Larissa's wrist, two overlapping crescents like a pair of open hands or small rising wings. Isolde recognized it. 6 months ago, Decca had asked her to help choose a design. He said it was a retirement gift for a longtime member of Vane Meridian's events team, a woman who preferred delicate jewelry. Isolde had spent 40 minutes with the jeweler getting the proportion right. She leaned slightly forward. Inside the cuff, an engraving caught the light. "For L after Thorngate, everything begins, D." She set her champagne glass down on a passing tray. Decca appeared at her side, without looking directly at her. "Are you enjoying the evening?" "I saw the bracelet." He was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he steered her toward a side corridor near the kitchen entrance. Larissa appeared from the opposite direction and stood beside him without being asked. Decca rubbed the back of his neck. "Things between us have been quiet for a long time." "You could have told me that." "It's complicated." "What I chose for the engraving is not complicated," Isolde said. "I chose that design for you." He looked toward the ballroom. "Larissa understands the pressure I'm under. She understands what it takes to lead at this level." Isolde looked at him evenly. "And I don't." "You have always been comfortable staying in the background," Larissa said from beside him. Isolde kept her eyes on her husband. "Do you love her?" He looked at the floor. She collected her coat and left. The invitation to Thorngate arrived 2 days later. Decca called it a chance to talk privately, somewhere calm, away from the office, he said. The family only wanted to settle things without anyone watching. Isolde knew it was not that. She went anyway. She needed one honest conversation from the man she had married, without Radcott managing the camera angles, without Larissa filling his silences. She arrived with Solange, who parked near the service entrance as Isolde requested. Greer met her in the lobby. The private lunch that followed removed the last of Isolde's remaining hope. Her place card had been crossed out and Larissa's name written above it. Orin described Decca's appointment as Vane Meridian's next president as though the board vote were a formality. Berenice discussed the announcement photographs. Culm assured Decca the directors would align once the separation from Isolde was finalized. Nobody looked at Isolde directly. She asked Decca to speak alone before the papers came out. They stepped onto the stone terrace. "I was outside the corridor at the reception," she said. "I saw you." He did not deny it. "What we had became something different," he said. "I don't know how to explain it." "I stayed with you the night your father almost lost everything," she said. "You sat on our kitchen floor and you told me you were terrified. You told me you didn't know how to face it without me. I stayed awake with you for hours." His expression tightened. "You were there emotionally. That's not the same as understanding the business." That word, emotionally, landed the way he knew it would. Before she could respond, Orin and Berenice came onto the terrace with the others. Bertram opened the leather folder. Radcott positioned himself near the doorway, phone angled slightly outward. Larissa took her place behind Decca's left shoulder. "Sign the petition," Orin said. "Show the board you can lead without complications." Decca looked at Isolde once. She searched his face for the man she had watched, early in their second week of knowing each other, kneel in the middle of a grocery store parking lot to help an elderly woman repack a torn paper bag that had split across the pavement. He hadn't known Isolde was watching from her car. He'd done it because the woman needed help and he had 2 free hands. That had been real. She could not reach it now. He lowered the pen and signed. 3 weeks later, the Vane family arrived at Thorngate's executive entrance for a planned investor tour. The access cards did not work. Decca pressed his against the terminal reader. The light flashed red. He wiped the card against his jacket and tried again. Orin tried his behind him. Red. Larissa's card produced the same result. Solange had arranged the Crane Heritage Group's legal team well before any of them arrived. Thaddeus walked out of the main entrance with outside counsel and 2 members of the independent board. "What is this?" Orin demanded. "The result of an audit your company has been under for 4 weeks." "I authorized no audit." "The controlling shareholder did." Orin stared at him. "Crane Heritage is a rescue partner. They don't make unilateral decisions about my properties." The rescue agreement transferred full governing authority to the controlling shareholder once the protected transition period expired. That period ended 8 days ago. A group of journalists had gathered at the far end of the building. They were present for a separately scheduled announcement about the company's ownership structure. They had not been told to watch this, but Orin's voice was carrying clearly across the courtyard. Decker looked toward the main entrance. The heavy doors opened from inside. Isolde walked out. She wore a dark jacket and low boots. No security, no briefcase, nothing that announced wealth or declared arrival. She crossed the courtyard as though she had been crossing it for years, because in every way that mattered she had. Decker did not move. Berenice turned toward Thaddeus. "Remove her." Not one staff member moved. Thaddeus addressed the group. "This is Isolde Crane Vane, Chief Executive Officer and sole beneficiary of the Crane Heritage Group. The Crane Heritage Group controls 71% of Vane Meridian Hotel's voting shares through the Crane Heritage Trust." Silence spread across the courtyard. Orin shook his head. "Her father left her a small trust. Decker said so years ago." Isolde stopped 10 feet from her husband. "You assumed it was small," she said. "You never asked." Orin stepped toward her. "This is still my company. I built this brand over 30 years. "You built its name," she said. "Your debts forced someone else to save everything underneath it." Decker had not moved since she appeared. His face showed something she could not fully identify. Not anger, not relief. Something closer to the slow recognition of a man recalculating every memory he thought he understood. "You knew," he said quietly. "I told you my father left me a hospitality trust. You decided what it was worth without asking me to explain it. If I had known the truth. If learning the truth is what would have changed how you treated me," Isolde said, "then what you felt was never what I thought it was." Thaddeus handed Orin a certified notice. Protected chairmanship expired. Discretionary access to company properties, accounts, staff and vehicles withdrawn pending civil proceedings. Colm was suspended pending review of the redirected operating funds. Radcott's employment had been terminated after investigators recovered altered records and instructions to suppress security footage from the Thorngate terrace, which Greer had quietly preserved through the property's outside counsel before Orin could order it erased. Outside counsel approached Decker separately. "Your suspension is effective as of this morning. The independent committee will provide its findings through your counsel." Decker looked at the notice without reading it. He looked at Isolde. "I need to explain something. Your counsel will communicate with mine." "Isolde, please." "No." She turned toward Thaddeus and said something quietly. Then she walked back toward the entrance. Berenice moved into her path. "After everything this family gave you," she said. Isolde stopped. "You welcomed me only when I stayed beneath you," she said. "That is not a family. That is a condition." She looked at the woman who had thrown her clothes. "What happened on that terrace would have been wrong regardless of who I turned out to be. That is the part none of you seem willing to face." Berenice's lips pressed together. She had no answer that fit the moment. Isolde walked inside. The consequences arrived without drama, through audits and civil proceedings and debt obligations bearing Orin's own signature. Orin lost his chairmanship permanently. Civil filings recovered funds misused for Thorngate renovations and the New York brand event. His personal guarantees against Thorngate's operating loans placed the property under lender review. The man who had said the Vane name was the company's most valuable asset watched that name disappear from the corporate structure one certified document at a time. Decker's expected appointment became a termination. He applied to other hotel groups but could not adequately explain the audit findings in any interview that moved past the first 45 minutes. He moved out of the company apartment and into a modest rental in a neighborhood where no one recognized his face. The executive car was returned. The credit accounts closed. The people who had planned his future with him stopped answering their phones within a week. Larissa's termination was upheld after investigators matched her signature, to 16 falsified expense reports. Her claim that she had only followed Decca's approvals collapsed against her own emails, her own requests, her own hotel invoices. She lost the position and, more permanently, the decade of industry relationships she had built around access to the Vane name. Colm faced civil liability for redirecting the operating reserve. Radcott was named in the investigation for tampering with records and attempting to suppress the Thorngate Terrace footage. Isolde had disclosed her conflict of interest at the first committee meeting and left before any vote involving Decca's employment was taken. She asked the board to follow the evidence and protect the workers, and then she stepped outside and let the process work without her hand in it. She appointed Damaris as Vane Meridian's interim president because Damaris understood operations, had protected the company when it mattered most, and treated the staff as the actual foundation of the business rather than its backdrop. She created an employee profit-sharing program. She restored the pension contributions Colm had deferred to protect discretionary spending. She funded scholarships for hospitality workers pursuing management and finance certifications because her father had once told her that the measure of any company was how it treated the people whose names would never appear in a press release. She had believed him at 17. She still believed him at 32. Several months after the courtyard, a handwritten letter arrived at the Crane Heritage Group's offices. Isolde recognized Decca's handwriting before she opened the envelope. He did not ask her to reconsider. He did not mention his father's pressure or his mother's influence or the things Larissa had told him. He accepted the choices he had made on the terrace and in the corridor and in the months that had led to both. He wrote that he finally understood the difference between apologizing because he'd been exposed and taking responsibility because honesty was the one thing he still owed her. Isolde read it at her desk. She placed it in the bottom drawer rather than the bin beside her chair. She was not sure yet what it meant, only that it was the first honest thing that had ever arrived in his handwriting. That evening, she drove to the Charleston property and walked out onto one of the restored ironwork balconies facing the harbor. The city carried its ordinary sounds below. Cargo ships rested at anchor. Aircraft lights crossed the water in slow arcs. She reached into her jacket pocket and held the small brass compass her father had kept on his desk for 30 years. He had given it to her, the year she turned 18, the day he first showed her the trust documents with her name on them. "True North doesn't move," he had said. "Everything else is weather." She was not celebrating anyone's ruin. She had never wanted that. What she had wanted, for years longer than she had admitted to herself, was simply to be seen clearly by someone who chose to stay. That had not happened the way she'd hoped. But she had finally stopped carrying that failure as though it belonged to her alone. Below, a Vane Meridian shuttle van pulled up to the main entrance. A family climbed out, 2 parents pulling luggage, while 2 small children ran ahead toward the lit lobby. A bellman in a pressed jacket came through the front doors to meet them, already smiling before they reached the step. 3,000 people had kept their jobs. Pensions were funded. The Charleston property was booked through October. Isolde placed the compass back in her pocket. A warm wind moved through the ironwork around her. The harbor lights reflected in slow, steady ripples below. She had stopped being someone's quiet secret. She had stopped making herself smaller to fit inside someone else's version of who she was allowed to become. The woman Berenice had thrown clothes at. The woman Decca had signed away while his mistress watched. The woman Orin had assumed could be dismissed without consequence. That woman had been keeping their entire world upright, and she had done it without asking for a single thing in return. She turned toward the warm light of the ballroom behind her, where the Vane Meridian staff was already setting up for tomorrow's conference guests, and walked inside to join them.